Happy Confederate History Month. This month, we will be exploring the last heir of Mount Vernon. John Augustine Washington III, nicknamed Gus, was the great-grandnephew of George Washington and the last private owner of Mount Vernon. The fourth of 5 children, he was born on May 3, 1821, to John Augustine Washington II and Jane Charlotte Blackburn Washington. John Augustine spent his childhood at his parents' Blakely plantation in West Virginia, but after the deaths of Supreme Court Justice Bushrod Washington and his wife Julia in 1829, the Mount Vernon estate became the possession of Bushrod's nephew, John Augustine Washington II. Bushrod Washington was a co-founder and president of the American Colonization Society, which promoted the emigration of freed slaves to Africa and partially resulted in the country of Liberia. Washington emancipated slaves himself, and he relied on the desires of the slaves who were given their own quarters, guns, and game at Mount Vernon, as well as slaves who had chosen to stay on at Mount Vernon after being emancipated. These included members of the Lee family and West Ford. Many of these individuals were buried alongside members of the Washington family in the 1850s and 1860s, and you can visit their graves today. The nephew of American founding father and President George Washington, Bushrod Washington inherited his uncle's papers directly, and Mount Vernon, taking possession in 1802 after the death of Martha Washington, his uncle's widow. He published a biography of the first president. In the autumn of 1837, Gus, now 16, was at Mount Vernon for the installation of a sarcophagus to replace the original containing the remains of George Washington, his great-great-uncle. Created and donated by Philadelphia Mason John Struthers based on a design by his business partner William Strickland, the new sarcophagus was crafted from Pennsylvania marble. In October, Struthers supervised the replacement inside the family vault on the grounds of Mount Vernon. Working by candlelight, workers stripped away the deteriorating original sarcophagus and discovered that the wood and lead inner coffin had partially collapsed. A section of the lead-lined lid was pulled back to reveal the head and chest of the father of the country. What a moment for Gus. An eyewitness recalled the eye sockets were large and deep, and the breadth across the temples, together with the forehead, appeared of unusual size. There was no appearance of grave clothes. The chest was broad, the color dark, with the appearance of dried flesh, adhering closely to the bones. We saw no hair, nor was there any offensive odor from the body. A hand was laid upon the head and instantly removed. The lid was restored to its original place, and 6 men completed the transfer of the coffin and body to the new sarcophagus, now in the new tomb of Mount Vernon. As the son of a wealthy Virginia planter, Gus enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle, developing interests in politics, hunting, and agriculture. He also may have attended school with Robert E. Lee in Alexandria, Virginia. After Bushrod's heir and Gus's father, John Augustine II, passed away in June 1832, the estate was left to his widow, Jane Charlotte, who vowed to maintain the estate to the best of her ability without involving her children's inheritances. While John Augustine Washington III preferred more aristocratic pastimes and was a devoted diary writer, his mother insisted he attend college after his father's death. He graduated from the University of Virginia in 1840, returning to Mount Vernon in September 1841 with a proposition to manage the plantation for his mother. she agreed, loaning her 20-year-old son 22 slaves and contracting his employment for $500 per year for 7 years, which enabled her to rest from the physically taxing plantation work, which required constant maintenance on horseback. John Augustine was lucky enough to inherit Mount Vernon during a time of protectionist trade policy. The Tariff Act of 1789 was still in force, and from 1790 to 1860, average tariffs increased from 20% to 60%, comprising the bulk of the federal government's revenue, before declining again to 20%. These tariffs ensured a natural preference for homegrown crops and enabled a strong position for American farms. Contrast this to today, where no sweeping tariff legislature has been passed, and so we see record farm bankruptcies across the country. As the oldest living male heir of the family, Gus positioned himself to take possession of Mount Vernon. While she did not pass away until 1855, she gave her son the proverbial keys to the kingdom for about a decade, granting him full autonomy to run the plantation as he saw fit. She is buried in the Mount Vernon New Tomb. Gus quickly realized the deteriorating Mount Vernon estate was a far cry from the profitable plantation his great-great-uncle George Washington once presided over. The government was really focused on slavery in the 1850s instead of economic decisions. The Missouri Compromise, enacted in 1820, was the first real legislative attempt to resolve the question of whether enslavement in America should continue. As new states entered the Union from the West, the question of whether those states would allow the practice of enslavement and be slave states, or free states, arose. When Missouri sought to enter the Union as a pro-slavery state, the issue became enormously controversial due to the federal government's desire for control. After the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, the United States gained vast tracts of territory formerly belonging to Mexico, including California, Arizona, and New Mexico. The question of whether to continue the practice for enslavement was at the forefront of national politics, and it came to great prominence once again with this introduction of new states. The Compromise of 1850 was a series of bills in Congress that sought to settle the issue but failed. The Compromise contained 5 major provisions and established California as a free state, but left it up to Utah and New Mexico, full of prisoners of war, to decide the issue for themselves. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed Kansas to decide whether it would come into the Union as pro-slavery or free, a direct violation of the Missouri Compromise. Missourians felt cheated. Why did Kansas get to decide when there was such a huge outcry when Missouri wanted to be a slave state? The caning of Charles Sumner occurred on May 22, 1856, in the United States Senate chamber, when Representative Preston Brooks, a pro-slavery Democrat from South Carolina, used a walking cane to attack Senator Charles Sumner, an abolitionist Republican from Massachusetts. The modern media would have you believe that January 6th was the only violent attack in the U.S. Capitol, and its violence is severely called into question as to who was doing the violence. But this is false. Because politicians were beating each other in 1856 and massive egos were bruised among other things, the American people had to suffer. And suffer they did. After the attack, Abraham Lincoln ascended to the national stage after his brief break from politics in the 1850s. Gus would have been aware of all of these developments and threw himself into Mount Vernon preservation as he saw storm clouds gathering. Under his leadership, Mount Vernon's primary means of income came from wheat and potatoes, wood cutting, selling slaves, and outsourcing slave labor to poor whites, collecting land rents, and its herring operation on the Potomac River. However, soil degradation, poor harvests, temperamental weather, and the devastation of crops by insects and pests limited the agricultural returns. Gus managed to slow Mount Vernon's financial decline, but these endeavors were not enough to stop the downward spiral, and as the government turned away from plantations, times were tough. In addition to facing these hardships, Gus experienced a constant interruption by sightseers, many of whom wanted to meet him as the living descendant of General George Washington, see the mansion, and ask questions about Washington's life. This was the era of the American visitor, and strangers were expected to entertain visitors who came to see them, sometimes at great expense. Some of the plantations of Fredericksburg, Virginia, were plunged into debt with this new tourism across the East Coast. America was a much smaller country then and much more hospitable. I have no objection to any sober or orderly persons gratifying their curiosity in viewing the buildings, gardens, etc. about Mount Vernon, George Washington wrote in his later years. Emphasis on sober and orderly. Washington would not want tourists reeking of weed around his manor. The visitors in the 1800s were considered a nuisance to John Augustine's family, and their presence slowed plantation work for slaves, overseers, and hired farm laborers. Initially, Gus followed the policies of his mother, father, and Uncle Bushrod, publishing trespassing notices around Mount Vernon, requesting letters of introduction to enter the mansion, and denying the landing of steamboats on the Potomac. You can take a ferry today from Mount Vernon to various cities, indicating its extreme access. But with Mount Vernon yielding such little profit, Gus decided to embrace historical tourism and implemented business strategies to extract money from the thousands of visitors who journeyed to the home of George Washington, including poet Emily Dickinson, and you can learn more about Dickinson's mother in her video on this channel. In order to bring more to the estate, he entered into a contract with the proprietors of the Thomas Collier to permit their steamboat to dock directly at Mount Vernon. He also promoted and invested in the construction of the Alexandria, Mount Vernon, and Accotink Turnpike roads, which was designed to make travel easier to Mount Vernon overland. As more visitors descended upon the grounds, he instructed slaves and laborers to sell bouquets of flowers, fruit, milk, and hand-carved canes to tourists throughout the estate and along what is now the George Washington Parkway. Even today, daffodils and wildflowers grow along the parkway. Beyond the property boundaries, he went into business with James Crutchett, who purchased timber from Mount Vernon and manufactured wooden Washington trinkets near the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Depot, now on New Jersey Avenue, in Washington, D.C. While Gus capitalized on the American fascination with George Washington, just as his ancestor Bushrod did with his published Washington biography, the sales were not substantial enough to retain the estate. He attempted to sell the property to both the federal government and the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, but both bodies were deeply mired in sectional and political partisanship. We should all thank God the property was not sold to the American federal government, which would have probably bulldozed it in a few years. That is what happened to Robert E. Lee's estate, which was first leveled and then filled with Union dead. Confederate dead were banned to create Arlington Cemetery and Alexandria National Cemetery. In 1843, a newspaper reported that the house, tomb, and grounds of Mount Vernon were available for purchase. This was a lie, but speculators were interested in the property. In his 1916 book, Mount Vernon, Washington's Home and the Nation's Shrine, historian Paul Wilstash stated Washington rebuffed entreaties by private parties as early as 1848 due to his concern of how they would treat his ancestral home, and turned down offers for as much as $300,000, or about $11 million today. While Gus held out hope for some sort of lifeline, help arrived from an unexpected source. Anne Pamela Cunningham, a 37-year-old South Carolinian who suffered chronic pain from a horseback riding accident during her youth, entered the scene. Her mother, Louisa, regularly shuttled by steamer from the family home to Philadelphia, where her daughter received medical treatments. On one trip in 1853, as the steamboat passed by Mount Vernon, Louisa noted the condition of the home. She wrote to her daughter with an idea that organized Southern women could salvage Mount Vernon. One of the women was newspaper magnate Randolph Hearst's mother, and you can learn more about her on this channel. Cunningham followed up on her mother's suggestion. In December 1853, her call to action, signed The Southern Matron, appeared in the Charleston Mercury. Ladies of the South, can you be still with closed souls and purses, while the world cries shame upon America and suffer Mount Vernon, with all its sacred associations, to become, as is spoken of and probable, the seat of manufacturers and manufactories, noise and smoke, and the busy hum of men, destroying all sanctity and repose around the tomb of your own world's wonder. Oh, it cannot be possible. The Yankees would not let this stand. Another writer attacked her as a swindler and secession spy. She carries a warrior's heart in her bosom and is doubtless as ready to see this conflict go on as Beauregard and Davis, announced the press of Philadelphia, referencing one of the Confederacy's most prominent generals and its president. Cunningham's appeal, aimed at patriotic Southern women and capitalizing on the fear of the Northern industrial juggernaut powered by money lending in violation of biblical text, worked. Her message ignited passions and launched an organic movement. Overcoming Washington's initial skepticism and working with the Virginia legislature, Cunningham and her supporters secured a state-approved charter for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, MVLA, and set about fundraising. Their fundraising efforts would later see the estate lit up by Thomas Edison himself and patrolled by Henry Ford's own vehicles. In March 1858, Virginia's House of Delegates authorized the purchase of Mount Vernon with 106 yeas and 2 nays, and the Senate approved the bill. A month later, Cunningham, as the regent, assisted by vice-regents and lawyers of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, met with Washington in Richmond and sealed the deal. They agreed to a $200,000 sales price with a down payment of $18,000 and 4 years to pay the balance, with all of their assurances to the dedication of the South. Gus was convinced neither the federal nor the Virginia government would meet his terms, and both those bodies were focused on the sanctity of private property at the time, so he agreed to sell 200 acres of the Mount Vernon estate. We see a lack of Washington family burials at Mount Vernon after that sale, indicating almost complete takeover by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Gus and his family vacated Mount Vernon for their new home, Waveland plantation, in February 1860. But Gus couldn't bear to part with all of Mount Vernon, and he brought Mount Vernon magnolias to Waveland in Marshall, Virginia. The Waveland plantation website is very detailed and contains many photos. Here are some of their wonderful descriptions. Washington made many changes in the Waveland house, with brick burned on the place, perhaps due to escaped slaves who were recorded as terrorizing the countryside in 1861. Gus added an addition to the rear that more than doubled the building's size. He tore off the original small colonial entrance porch and built an ornate porch across the entire front of the house, extending around each side past the doors at either end of the front hall. He added a bay window in each of the 4 front rooms and supported the walls with 12 by 12 oak timbers. With time, these began to give way, letting the walls above sag. In 1928, the bay windows were removed and the original windows were restored. The front wraparound porch, a classic in Southern architecture, was removed in 1938, but the rear remains. The beautiful marble mantels were presumably installed by Gus himself. The rooms in the front hall have handsome cornices made of molded plaster, and the center of each of the ceilings in the 2 front rooms have elaborate plaster medallions, presumably planned for chandeliers. The locks, hinges, and all of the hardware are original to the house. The windows have inner blinds as well as outside shutters, and the windowsills and lintels in both the old and new section of the home are of white stone, as are the door sills. The graceful stairway is framed with a circular mahogany handrail. 7 chimneys provide each room with a fireplace, and the bedrooms have clothes closets on either side of the chimneys. The front southern room was lined with bookcases to accommodate some of Mount Vernon's papers, which Gus took with him. In the master bedroom, part of the new addition at the rear, Gus installed a large walk-in safe with double iron doors that were originally painted with decorative flowers, vines, and shrubs, presumably by some of his daughters. During the war between the states, the family silver was removed to Kinloch in the Plains and placed in the pigeon cote to avoid potential looting by the Yankees. There are also 3 relatively modern bathrooms, paneled head-high and containing usual fixtures with the sole exception of a commode, which was outside. The bathrooms were installed by a plumber that had put plumbing in the White House. One was preserved in its original condition, although not functional. There is also a 6-foot-long copper tub to fit the 5'11" Gus, and it has a top-edge wood trim. The sides are of paneled wood, so the tub is boxed in. All of this rests on a low drainage platform. Supposedly this was to catch any splash. There is even a shower with a filigree fin head. The lavatory is marble with a paneled cupboard underneath. A ceramic latrine is affixed to the wall. Lead piping required no T's or L's as the pipe itself was bent or curved to go in the desired direction. Several of Gus's daughters and some of their friends provided an inscription in 1866 on an upstairs bedroom window pane. Presumably Louisa Fontaine Washington, the oldest, served as an engraver with a family diamond ring. Washington engaged a local farm manager, James Thomas Ford, who was housed in a 2-up, 2-down small farmhouse located in a field just south of Waveland. Ford's son, Robert Bob Newton Ford, was reportedly so bad that when he went to town, his mother sewed up his pant pockets so he would not steal so much. I'm not sure if this family was related to the West Ford family from Mount Vernon, but it's possible. The Ford family departed Waveland for the West soon after the Civil War, and Bob Ford elected to go into business with the James boys. He gained considerable notoriety when he shot his friend Jesse James, and hence appears in the Ballad of Jesse James, that dirty little coward that shot Mr. Howard. Lawrence Washington, the oldest son of Gus, came into possession of Waveland by inheritance and by purchase from his younger brother, George. Lawrence married Fanny Lackland and returned to Waveland, where 9 of their 12 children were born and raised. Not proving to be a successful farmer, Lawrence was heavily in debt by 1895, which is possibly something Gus knew when he willed the property to his younger brother. An 85-page farm diary exists describing the daily activities and economics of farming at Waveland from July 1885 to January 1889, and this is a separate document than all of the documents held at the Mount Vernon archive by Gus. Bedford Glasscock purchased the estate in May 1895, and his descendants retain it over a century later. About a year after the sale of Mount Vernon, the Commonwealth of Virginia called for a convention to debate the issue of secession, and in April 1861, Virginia delegates responded to the firing on Fort Sumter by voting in favor of leaving the United States. They did not have much of a choice. The federal government desperately wanted to invade Virginia and its farmlands, and was prepared to do so with a foreign fighting force. Over a third of Union Army soldiers were foreign, and the very real reality of Virginia homeowners being unable to speak to 500,000 fighting men who pillaged, stole, trespassed, and yes, raped on their properties was absolutely more than they could bear. Military Images has a great in-depth write-up on Washington's time in the CSA, and this includes parts from that wonderful write-up. Gus joined the Confederate Army as a lieutenant colonel, and he served as aide-de-camp to his relative by marriage and arguably the greatest general in American history, General Robert E. Lee. He brimmed with anticipation as he saddled up for his first ever reconnaissance in September 1861. Resplendent in gray uniform and plumed hat, the tall and graceful lieutenant colonel with chestnut hair, bushy beard, and brown eyes lobbied his commanding officer for this opportunity. At the end of July 1861, following the victory at Manassas, Lee departed Richmond, accompanied by Washington, for Western Virginia. Lee, on his first field assignment of the war, had orders to protect railroads from Sherman's war crimes, recapture lost territory, and quell the growing movement towards statehood. It is a reality that we all have to live with, that we will never see the glory of Atlanta or Memphis or Nashville because the American federal government destroyed and burned and looted those cities, and nobody ever bothered to rebuild them to their former marbled glory. On September 6, 1861, Washington wrote to a friend, "I don't know when I shall leave this region, or indeed whether I ever shall do so, as of course my chances are the same as those of other men, and I know that some of us will never get away." He shared Lee's tent and was appointed to assist him. On September 12, 1861, Union forces on Cheat Mountain and Elk Water turned back Lee's two-pronged advance. The next day, Washington, Rooney Lee, who was Lee's son, and two others rode off in the direction of Elk Water to study the enemy's right flank. Washington was sprayed with a load of bullets and his horse went down. He went down with it, and Union soldiers found him gasping for breath with a revolver pointing at them in one hand. Rooney Lee escaped. The dying officer called for water at some point. One account notes that a soldier opened his canteen and offered a drink, but the man died. Another account states that a soldier ran to a nearby creek to fetch water but did not return in time. Company E returned to camp with the corpse and sent word to its commanding colonel, West Point-educated Milo Smith Haskell, that they had killed a rebel field officer. Haskell and a few others soon arrived and inspected the body. They easily discovered the man's identity, for his name was written on his gauntlets, a handkerchief, a napkin, and his haversack. John Augustine Washington III was dead. Word spread through the Union camp as this was a considerable moral victory for them. Someone, likely a surgeon, unbuttoned Washington's blood-stained coat and rifled through his clothes and haversack. They found a fine specimen of a man, perhaps 35 to 40 years old, 5 feet 10 inches in height, clear skin, fine features, with raven hair, whiskers, and mustache. 3 balls had struck him fair in the back, and within a few inches of each other, passing clear through, coming out at his breast. He had a splendid pair of pistols, a heavy knife, a fine opera glass in leather case, an old-fashioned gold watch with heavy gold chain, fine spurs, etc. About $80 in gold and $0.75 in silver. A map of the country below us, with farms, their locations, etc. A letter through one end of which a ball had passed. We gave back the private property, keeping as contraband the pistols, knife, glass, map, and small powder flask. Upon hearing the rumors, Lee demanded the body of Washington be returned to the Confederates, dead or alive. It had to be transported under a flag of truce. This was no small gesture. Union forces had carved under this tree on the 13th of September, 1861, fell Colonel John A. Washington, the degenerate descendant of the father of his country. Various Union officers insisted Washington had turned and ran and was shot in the back like a coward. The Yankee press couldn't have been more pleased. One Ohio newspaper noted, "The miserable creature who had been speculating in the bones of his illustrious great-grand-uncle, whose name he was unworthy to bear, in all probability has met his just deserts. He was a miserly, mean man, and well-designed in every respect to oppose and destroy the heritage which the great Washington labored so hard to secure." A Wisconsin newspaper stated, "John A. Washington was a disgrace to Virginia, and dying his death disgraced her sacred soil. Of him can it be said that he died unwept, unhonored, and unhung. My wish is that the memory of the great immortal Washington will not be insulted by laying the bones of the wretched namesake upon any portion of Mount Vernon. The distance between the burial places should be continents. He deserves no resting place in the United States, save it be at Charleston, South Carolina. Unfortunately, this journalist had somewhat of his wish, and Gus would not be buried at Mount Vernon. The Indiana Journal boasted, John A. Washington disgraced the name he bore, and we are proud that Indiana has the honor of sending to the battlefield a soldier that killed so vile a traitor. The soldier who performed the deed should have honorable mention on the historic page of the Hoosier State. Brigadier General Reynolds took custody of items found on Washington's body deemed to be contraband. He distributed them as war trophies, and there is no record of where they are now. Reynolds held back one revolver, which he sent to Secretary of War Simon Cameron in Washington, D.C. Cameron, despite coming from a German pub-keeper family, was raised by the Jewish Grawl family of Subury. Cameron replied to Reynolds, I shall always prize it as a memorable relic of the present glorious struggle for freedom and the Union. Cameron confirmed Reynolds' disposition of the other items. To the brave Sergeant Weiler of the 17th Indiana Regiment, who enjoys the honor of having made this notorious rebel leader bite the dust, you will, in the name of the War Department, present the other revolver and articles found upon the traitor's person and retained in your care. The Southern press, wisely not believing everything the Yankee press stated, held out hope that Washington was alive until his remains arrived on a train in the Confederate capital in September 1861. The Richmond Dispatch portrayed Washington's reconnaissance as a daring ride within short distance of the enemy invaders of his home state, observing, he has fallen a blessed martyr in the just and sacred cause of his country, and a grateful people will enroll high his name among those who have fallen in defense of the dearest rights, those rights, of course, being private property. Lee expressed his profound sorrow and grief to a friend on September 14th, the same day he received Washington's remains. The country has met with a great loss in his death. Our enemies have stamped their attack upon our rights with additional infamy by killing the lineal descendant and representative of him who, under the guidance of Almighty God, established them and by his virtues rendered our republic immortal. Lee informed Washington's eldest daughter, Louisa, who had also lost her mother, of her father's death. My intimate association with him for some months has more fully disclosed to me his great worth than double so many years of ordinary intercourse would have been sufficient to reveal. We have shared the same tent, and morning and evening has his earnest devotion to Almighty God elicited my grateful admiration. He is now safely in heaven, I trust, with her he so loved on earth. We ought not to wish him back. Lee further remembered, he was always anxious to go on these reconnaissance expeditions. The day I sent him was the first day I assented. The two men had shared many conversations and moments together as tent mates and potential previous classmates, and Lee admired Washington's unflinching devotion to Almighty God, assuring Louisa he is now safely in heaven. The Washingtons were deeply devout Christians and prayed in churches across Alexandria, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. Gus was buried in the Zion Episcopal Churchyard in Charlestown, West Virginia. His wife, Eleanor Love Selden Washington, had died in 1860 from childbirth. Both were said to have been buried below the Waveland mansion toward the southeast. Later, their bodies were exhumed and interred in Charlestown, West Virginia, where Gus's brother, Richard B. Washington, lived. It would have been unbelievably painful for Washington to know Mount Vernon was used by Union forces, and there's a debate whether he actually did know that. Graffiti still exists on the bricks of the new tomb there, showing soldiers were on Mount Vernon and watching Washington's grave. In direct contrast to the barbarism of today, which includes digging up Confederate graves such as A.P. Hill's, which you can learn about in the Marxism and Robert E. Lee video on this channel, Washington's tomb was not disturbed by any soldier during the Civil War. But now we get to the mystery. Despite not being buried at Mount Vernon, Gus and his mother had or have memorial plinths at the estate. But lately it seems all reference to the CSA and the Confederacy has been removed. In recent photos beside the tomb, Gus's plinth is not to be seen. Was it moved? Was it hidden? It references the Confederacy, but was this such a trigger for the insecure among us that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association decided to remove the plinths altogether? Did the Mount Vernon Ladies Association bend the knee to the Marxist Bolshevik forces behind BLM and Antifa? Let us hope not and consider to support the Washington family.